Welcome again to the third webinar in our Power of Social Innovation series. Today's webinar, The Role of Procurement in Social Innovation Funding, is sponsored by the Ash Center's Government Innovators Network. Before I pass the floor over to Professor Moore, we have some polling questions for you in the audience that will help make our remarks as relevant as possible. First question, I'll leave each one up for a few moments. What sector do you work? You just click on the small left circle to the left-hand side of each choice. Just a few more seconds. Next question, how would you describe your roles or responsibilities? Just a few more seconds, and we'll go on to the next question. Do you deal directly with a government procurement process in the course of your work? And one more question, just to get a sense of how many of us there are today. Okay, I'm going to close this in 5 seconds, and then we'll begin. Bear with me one moment, please. Great, let's get started.
So, welcome. My name is Mark Moore. I'm delighted to join Tim in welcoming you to this webinar. I've been associated with the Social Innovation Project here at Harvard for a while, and I'm delighted to be able to moderate this discussion. I'm particularly pleased because we have here with us the two people that I would describe as the dream team of consultants with respect to government procurement activities for social innovators. If you are a person in the private sector with an idea that you are desperately hopeful that the government would try, or if you're a person in the government with a problem and you're desperately searching for a private sector solution, you couldn't do better than to call on David Griggin and Linda Gibbs to give you advice about how to do that job. Linda has done an exceptional job of opening the doors of the New York City administration to social entrepreneurs and stimulating them to put proposals in front of the government. And David Griggin has been tireless and creative and innovative in his efforts to find ways to get money to important new ideas. So we're very lucky to have these two, and I won't waste any more of their time. I think David will be the first presenter, and he'll talk for about 7 minutes. Then Linda will talk for about 7 minutes, and then ideally we'll have an interactive discussion with questions. David?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the kind remarks in the introduction. It's actually thrilling to be associated with the project at Harvard and with Linda and the other folks who've been working on this for some time. We will find as we go through, I think, not only the slides, but more importantly our discussion today, that we have, there are no school solutions, if you will, to a lot of what we're going to talk about. There are living questions, and I think the dialogue, not only that we've been having for the past 2 or 3 years, at Harvard, but also the dialogue that we will continue today, is a valuable one. And that's why I'm very thankful to see so many people signed up and so many people joining us. And we do, in fact, as Mark said, want to make this a discussion, certainly not a lecture. So what I'd like to do is go through 3 very brief slides just in an effort to set up the discussion that we will have later. I want to talk a little bit about what I see today in the procurement landscape, and I know many of you are practitioners. I recognize names in our attendees list of people that I've worked with over the years, and I'm glad you're here. So talking about where we are today is really largely for folks that don't deal with the procurement process every day. I think all of us that deal with it on a daily basis are painfully aware of what the landscape looks like today. I will then briefly discuss what I think the vision should be for tomorrow, not only to support social entrepreneurship and other innovation, but broadly to move us from the process focus to the focus on results. And I think that all of us that are practitioners in the business of public acquisition recognize that if we are not delivering results, our time really is limited in the work that we do. And then finally, I'll share on a slide my thoughts about, well, how do you get from today to this vision? How do you actually begin to make the theory a reality? So that's my plan, and I will go here briefly through the slides that I think help me discuss that. As I said, a lot of folks that are dealing with procurement on a daily basis will know all too well that we are overly focused in the procurement business on the process. We are so focused on the process that it leaves, in many cases, little room or zero room for any waiver to go outside of any kind of a swim lane that you're in, to color outside the lines, or to practice a new idea that might be innovative and might lead to success. It leaves very, very little room for any sort of creative thought. We are process-focused. We are a control organization, and we often lord the fact that we are a control organization, we often lord that over, ironically, the very people that I would call my customers or my clients, the very people that I purport to serve. And how is it can I be a servant and a controller at the same time? I think the proper balance between those two things is critically important, but very different from the way we think in many cases today. We have, for a lot of reasons, some good and some not so good, and some ancient reasons, frankly, that were good reasons 50 years ago but may not be good reasons today. We have redundancy built upon redundancy, built upon more redundancy, and that assures us that we will never, stray from the very straight and narrow path that we follow every single day. But it also gives a tremendous burden in the expectations that our clients have of us with respect to the rapidity with which we can respond to their needs. And again, that's what we're here for, as procurement professionals and practitioners. We really are here to respond to their needs. We have a gross, in my opinion, disinterest, a practiced disinterest in the business that must serve us, our trading partners. And when I say trading partners, I literally mean partners. Everyone here who knows contract in theory knows that there is no successful contract without winners on both sides of the table. So a disbalanced contract, one that absolutely serves the government but is clumsy with respect to the way the business is done, is really not a good contract. And we have so many of those. In my experience, the 17 or 18 years that I've had the privilege of leading state procurement operations and the procurement operation here in the city of Washington, D.C., I've seen this many times. So what's the end result of all that? We have a very slow, a very laborious process that in the end delivers poor results. So if anyone here is satisfied with that, maybe it's in the phone call for you. I certainly think that we need to do better. Let's go to the next slide and see what I think that better looks like. I would propose that as a contracting officer, and again, I've done this for a number of years, that I have never been an expert in the way a business is going to deliver the solution that I need. I can hope to be very good at articulating the problem, but I really am not going to be good about describing the solution. And to be overly prescriptive in a specification or a statement of work or any kind of a procurement solicitation, I think it leads us to sort of work toward a solution that we certainly aren't experts in. I think we have to respect the fact, of course, that businesses are the experts in the goods and services they deliver and in the best way to deliver those. My belief is that if we could simplify our solicitations into problem statements, almost conversational statements of what we would like the result to be, that businesses would surprise us with their ability to innovate and to provide solutions to us. To do that, we need to be more conversant. We need to be more open in the way we communicate. We have a taught and reinforced fear of having communications with vendors. And I can probably count, over and over again the times that I've seen that work against us as opposed to work for us. We must invest, I think, in what works. And when Linda talks a little bit later, when we get into our conversation, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and I won't belabor it at this point. We have to be active listeners. Probably most of us are not taught to be active listeners. And yet I think that's so critically important to support the open communications that I described a moment ago. And we have to be open to innovative and sometimes complex, but very innovative funding. I don't want to call the budget process in government an impediment to good procurement, but it's another control process. It's a control process layered upon the control process that I'm discussing. And we have to be able to loosen the binds a little bit on some of these controls if we're truly going to see innovations and creative thought part of the way we provide solutions to the citizens we serve. I think all of that leads to a streamlined method of achieving business quality results. And I call it business quality results, meaning that if governments operated sort of as businesses, I think we would probably have all been out of business long ago. We certainly don't have the same metrics, and I wouldn't suggest that we should, that businesses have, but businesses have a survival instinct that is impressive. None of them exist to put themselves out of business, and they all exist to grow their business, I think, for the most part. And the result of that different way of thinking than we think in government is a completely different way of measuring results. And I think business quality results are ones we should all strive to achieve. So how do we get that done? It's much easier to state the problem and to even envision the future than to actually turn that into action. I think it really is a combination of the right people with the right skill sets, moderating and properly guiding, if you will, the right process, with plenty of room for that process to set its own roots and to grow as it learns. And processes, I want to consider the process a living thing, not something out of a code book. So people, I believe, need to be critical thinkers. We should never be satisfied with what we did yesterday, recognizing that there are so many things that change in the world on a daily basis, technology just being the most obvious, that we have to be learning and living organisms. They have to be critical of the past and open to the future, consultative in the way we deliver solutions to the people that we serve, focused on results more than the process, because after all, the result is the end game, and oriented towards solutions. I would call the people that I wish to be surrounded by trusted business consultants to the clients that I serve, the agencies of states of Texas and Indiana or the city of Washington, D.C. That combined with, I think, a process that builds in flexibility, that not only builds it in but celebrates it, that is not afraid of coloring outside the lines but more embraces the very idea that the good idea is right around that corner that you have yet to look around. That the process should require communications. We're pretty good, many of us, at things like pre-bid conferences or pre-proposal conferences or even pre-solicitation conferences where we have vendors come in and help us understand the lay of the land in their business before we even write the solicitation. But we can be much better. We can be in that closed period time in a procurement when we shut down all communications as we evaluate. We are notoriously bad, at least in my opinion, although getting better, at being open to additional input, which is, the nature of the living procurement system that I described. So we should require that communication. We should teach people to use communications aggressively tool towards success. And then finally, I think we need to enforce transparency much better than we are today. There seems to be no excuse in my mind why a question, any question, whether from a vendor or a member of the public or an agency that I serve, would have to be asked twice. By the second time I asked a question, I don't know why I don't just post that information on a website that allows everyone to find the answer as easily as the person that called me or emailed me found the answer. So that's it. In a capsule, I think those are that sets up, I hope, some of the discussion that I think we need to have today, and those are simply my thoughts, and those can grow, I think, as the result of our discussions today on where we are, where we ought to be, how we get there.
So thank you very much, David. Linda?
Thank you. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So let's go over to my slides. Here in New York, so I supervise the Health and Human Service agencies, and it was actually the recession and the impact of the recession on the nonprofits in the city that started a really serious discussion about how incredibly burdensome the procurement process was for our nonprofits, and started us thinking about what we could do to approach the procurement process differently to reduce the amount of time people are spending on entering into and negotiating and documenting and registering contracts, and freeing up that time to really focus on taking care of the people who they are contracted to serve. So just to describe the problem, this is a little summary that shows down the right-hand column is the left-hand column are a bunch of city agencies and the value of the contracts that are held by those agencies. And so you can see down at the bottom there $4 billion across those agencies. This was what was entered into for fiscal 2009. 3,700 contracts with 1,400 providers and employing hundreds of procurement staff in the agencies. So we have a lot of nonprofit organizations delivering services on behalf of the Health and Human Service agencies. And in fact, for folks like ACS and Homeless Services, which is DHS, HRA, our welfare agency, DFTA, which is our aging agency, the vast majority, 85 to 90% of the work that they do is done through contract nonprofits. And so this is important in terms of our ability to get our work done in the city. To make the matters worse, it's not, if you're a nonprofit doing work in the city, the chance that you have a single contract is small. And what this chart tries to do is to describe the overlap. And this is only in those circumstances where a nonprofit works with two different agencies. And so the way to read this chart is ACS, which is our child welfare agency, DOHMH, which is our health agency. Those two agencies have 43 nonprofit organizations in common, and those organizations have contracts worth $415 million. And so and then you go on and on from here, and in fact, many of our providers will have more than two contracts, and some of them can have as many as 6 or 7 or 8. You know, there's depending on how wide the services of the nonprofit is. And so then what happens is that all of the work associated with the procurement process actually gets duplicated over and over and over again. And so to the extent that you have to submit your 990, or you have to submit your org chart for your agency, or your budget, or your audits from the last 3 years, the way the incredible logic of our system is that we make you give that to us in multiple copies for every contract at every point of contract execution. And so it's a massive paper shuffle, which is not only wasteful, but inevitably the executive directors will be spending time calling around, figuring out whose desk the stuff is stuck on, or who lost a piece of paper, or what piece of documentation they left out of their proposal, which in fact could flaw their entire application. So wasteful, outdated, incredibly burdensome. And so our proposal, we're in the middle of launching this, and we're pretty seriously into it, is to streamline the process and to create for every organization that does business with the city a single master service agreement. So if you're, say, a settlement house, let's say the the Lower East Side Settlement House, and you have a youth services contract, you have a child welfare prevention contract, and you have a senior center. You'll no longer have three separate contracts with three separate agencies. What you'll have is one master service agreement with the city. And then, if you have an active master service agreement, any agency can draw a service order off of that contract and back it up with money from your program. And so what the agencies will do is focus on the scope of services and negotiate the relationship with the nonprofit for how they're going to approach the work and get the work done. And all of the work associated with documenting the credentials of the organization to do business with the city will be done in the central office through the master service agreement. And so we're trying to really shift the business end of the procurement process, all that technical stuff that David referred to as so sort of burdensome and bureaucratic. We're trying to isolate that in a simpler process being handled by a centralized staff, and then empowering the agencies really to engage in those the best practice conversations with the nonprofits. I'll say a few more things about this and then hopefully end with how we think this might enable some more innovation in approach. But one of the key things to this is also to, sort of come into the digital age and create what we're calling a data vault, a document vault, where nonprofits can keep a file of all of the critical corporate documents that are necessary in order to document their status as a good vendor for the city. And to do this in one place and then to have that vault have a system of alerts to let people know when they're, for instance, maybe your audit is coming due. It's going to expire if you have to have an audit that's done in the last 24 months. Well, 3 months your audit's outdated, so alert to you to get a new audit in. Or, just the goal being that all of those documents can be in one electronic place, no more lost documents in the paper shuffle, and the provider completely empowered to control that information and keep it up to date with alerts that where they may be falling into trouble. And in that way, anyone that can satisfy all of the documentation requirements can get a master service agreement, whether or not they are currently doing business with the city. It's kind of a zero value contract. And in this way, we actually hope to open up the business to newcomers. Right now, because the procurement process can be so, you have to be an insider, and you have to be on the known vendor list, and you have to be lucky enough to receive the email in order to get into the loop of a procurement cycle. Our goal here is that anybody who has an interest can get themselves a master service agreement, and then it'll make you active and eligible to receive contracts or service orders. But also we'll just put you in that automatic notification list. And it never closes. So if you miss the Friday 3 o'clock deadline, it doesn't matter because there's no deadlines anymore. The master service agreement relationship is constantly open. So bring new folks in. I think the challenge in doing this, and this will just get over to this question of data definitions and outcome measures, I could see two paths happening here. We're going to get the business side of the work, hopefully, much more streamlined. Our standard contract is, after 2 years of work, is now done, and so every social service contract we enter into moving forward is going to be on a standard term contract starting in September. I think the challenge in front of us is to categorize services. We have to create common definitions of services so that a job placement at our Small Business Services Agency may be called an employment milestone at our welfare agency and may be called a placement or something else by another, but they're really all the same thing. So one thing is to figure out what are the services, what are the common definitions or taxonomy for those services, get it organized in a way that is getting all the apples to be called apples and not to put an orange in there, and to make sure it's not called an orange if it is an apple. And then to get a set of outcome measures that are common to the services that will allow us to focus on achieving outcomes and leave flexibility at the provider side for what varying approaches they may take in achieving those outcomes. There is much more to be said about this, about how that work then in turn can help streamline the billing and payments, and even maybe we can go all the way upstream to client interactions, and so that when a caseworker does a field visit and sees a family, they can enter that once and not have to enter it again for some federal reporting purpose back at the office, and then enter it again for some billing and claiming purpose back to the budget office, and enter it again for some procurement purpose. But can we actually get these all tied into a single system that can feed those transactions all the way through these relationships and meet the various business purposes? So that's the grand scheme. The goal overall then, just to restate, is we want to make folks whose brains we want to focus on the quality of casework practice and improving the lives of people that we're serving. We want their brain power to be spent there, and to take all of the sort of the business work of procurement off their desks, and to make their life simpler, and in doing that, increase the flexibility in how they do that work through the contract process.
Thank you very much, Linda. Let me remind the participants that to make this interactive, you have to ask questions. And the way to do that is to click on the little heading that says Questions and Answer at the top of the screen, and that will allow you then to enter various questions on the screen, which I'll be able to monitor and then forward to David and to Linda. While you're getting accustomed to using that feature and taking advantage of it, let me address one question to David and one question to Linda. David, when you described the procurement system as too process-oriented, and it seems to me that there are really two slightly different processes that we're concerned about here. Let's call process number one the procurement process per se, and that is concerned with who gets the money, on what terms, how we monitor performance, when the payments go out, what kind of representations have to be made by the contractor to unleash payments, what kind of audit responsibilities they have, et cetera. And so let's call that the procurement process. There's a second process, though, that figured in some of Linda's comments, which is the process by which the money that we give to service providers is converted into services and outcomes. Right? So that, let's call that process 2. And in many respects, over the long run, the performance of the system will go up as we get better at process 2, and as people learn how to do use the money well to accomplish the social objectives. When you describe the procurement process as being too process-oriented, did you mean that we were spending too much time and energy on monitoring the flow of cash to contractors, or did you mean that we were spending too much time evaluating the performance of the contractors in terms of whether they followed particular processes rather than they achieved results?
It's a good question, Mark. I think it's a little bit of both, but probably far more the former, the process, than the latter. In fact, I'm not really sure in many cases that we really are monitoring a lot of the performance issue. That's another thing that I think needs to improve in the way we do business. Setting high expectations and expecting them to be met. It was much more the former. I think your description of two different processes is accurate.
Okay, so your idea then is of a process that reduces the burdens on the contractees, but has a little less of a focus and an instrument for guaranteeing that we get high levels of performance and that we learn over time.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, I think that sort of interestingly that there's a transition that occurs between the contracting staff, the staff that work in a procurement office, and the receiving agency staff. For example, agencies that Linda described. And I think those two processes basically occur in two different locations.
And is there a way that one way to think about this is that if we were interested in learning from about process 2, you could imagine that the contract would create an occasion for there to be a conversation between the contractor and the content person in the agency that would be in some sense hosted and monitored and facilitated by the procurement agent.
That should happen more often than it does. I think your point is well taken and accurate. That conversation, that goes sort of to the point that I tried to make on open and continuous communications.
Right.
I think that we need much more of exactly what you've described.
But it's a three-way communication then between the contractor, the procurement officer, and the program manager in the agency rather than a two-way conversation between the procurement officer and the contractor.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I would almost argue that you could probably substitute the agency person for the procurement officer. I'm not really sure how much of a role. We tend to want to stifle communications, and I think that at the point that the contract is in place, that there are understood terms and conditions on both sides of the contract table that are going to lead to some positive result, that at that point I think the procurement personnel to some degree should remain silent. I'm not saying that we don't need to be involved in the conversation, but we shouldn't be steering it.
Okay. Linda, the question, still looking at the question and answer page here, and it looks to me like all we've got is people struggling with the audio thing rather than making substantive questions. So I'll carry on with another question for Linda. Linda, this system that you described is as an improvement that has the master, what did you call it, the master contract?
Master service agreement, yeah.
Master service agreement. And then that provides essentially a institutional relationship that allows money to pass from the public sector to the private supplier, and is then being guided by something that's called the, what did you call it, the work order or the
service order, work order, yeah.
Service order, right. Now, the thing that I was puzzled about that is, and I think you were explaining that the service order would be competitive.
Yep.
That is that an agency would say, we're going to write a service order for the following particular set of services, and everybody who has a relevant master contract would then be, or master service agreement would be invited to bid for that. Is that right?
That's right, and we can use all different kinds of processes. I don't think this new streamlined process should be used as an excuse to go to sole source negotiation. I actually think competitive bidding in the social services is valuable, keeps folks thinking, keeps them on their toes, and helps to, the competitive process can really help to bring out a lot of new ideas and new approaches. That being said, this doesn't fundamentally change the rules about your manner of selecting your vendors. And as you were talking to David, I actually was reflecting on all of the different performance-based contracting systems that we have in New York and how we've been able to use the outcome measurement with our nonprofit providers to really encourage them toward delivering best outcomes for clients. And we have really sophisticated tools that tell us who's good at doing that and who's not. So our performance evaluation systems are pretty sophisticated at this point. Despite that fact, we still, when we're ready to go and re-up a contract, we'll write a scope of services and we'll ask the very same providers to write down the approach that they would take in order to deliver the service. And their performance outcome reports don't judge who gets the contract.
Don't weigh in on that. Right.
Yeah, and it's like,
so it's like you have to ignore a critical piece of information you've got, which is their actual ability to perform.
Yeah, and it gets to, there's some folks, and we know there's lots of consultants hired to write the
an RFP response. And I think we have to think more about how to use good quality performance rating systems to be our judgment about who gives us the best outcomes, and rely on that more in the competitive process, rather than having everybody take the incredible time that it does take to write as thorough a proposal as they can when a contract cycle comes around.
Okay. This is a little bit related to another question I was going to ask as well, which was a question that had to do with how we should treat the possibility that a contractor regarded their knowledge, their processes for producing results as proprietary. So suppose you've got a new drug treatment program, and they believe they have a very effective way of persuading people to stop using cocaine, and they're happy to describe it to you, but they don't want it to go to anybody else.
Well, that's every proposal. That's interesting, because proposals, once you enter into contract, become part of the terms of the contract, and the scope of service is a public document. And I don't know, David, have you come across different approaches for that kind of trade secrets?
We actually, in the procurement process, as long as I've been involved in it in 3 different governments, we always have the stipulation in proposals that the responding vendor, the proposer, may mark information as confidential, but we further say that it's up to us to determine whether we believe it or not. And that actually puts fear into the heart of many vendors that have proprietary information that they truly want to protect. We tend, I talked about transparency for a few minutes in my opening remarks. This is a place where you need to be very careful to respect the expert knowledge that you want your innovators to bring to the table. And I think that if we are overly open with information that a vendor construes as proprietary, I think we drive away the world's most innovative vendors. And I think that's actually an impediment within the procurement process that we need to solve.
Okay, we do have some questions here. There's a question from Leonard Carey, who asked a question about how closely involved your legal department was in developing the process. And I guess that's directed to you, Linda, and whether legal rules that were designed to protect fair opportunities for vendors to compete for contracts played an important role in the way you designed the system.
Well, in particular, creating our standard contracts, the lawyers took the lead on that. And it was a funny process because I would say 95% of the language of the contracts across the 10 agencies was the same. But that 5% was so dearly held by each agency, and so it was a real negotiation to try to convince the agencies that, all those little idiosyncratic phrases that they had dropped in over the years were not necessary, or in a couple of situations they actually convinced us that they were necessary and they got adopted into the standard contract. So the lawyers were very involved there. To a certain degree, first I'll just tell everybody that I'm a lawyer. To a certain degree, we had to keep the lawyers out of the process in order to get the sort of a creative new approach and come up with the solution and then come back to the lawyers and show them how it was possible. Because, their job is to defend, and of course they want, they tend to be more conservative and not want to make changes, because change opens up the possibility of challenge and ambiguity. And so they're always critical and well, not always, but usually helpful. But I think that sometimes we really just had to say, what do we want, without regard to whether it was going to be allowed or not allowed. And then once we got what we wanted down on paper, now let's back into all the constraints and see how we can satisfy them.
Okay, there's a question also about whether there's any advice to be given about when to use a grant and when to use a contract, which is, and is it related to a certain kind of product or service that you're, or do you have a different stance toward different organizations depending upon how closely allied your objectives are to their objectives, or what is it?
Now, it's interesting. In our terminology, a grant is we usually use it when we're really just giving money to an organization to do a good thing and we're not focused on delivering a particular outcome. When we're talking about selecting a single predetermined vendor to do something, our lingo for that is a sole source procurement. And the typical situations when we see them as useful is when somebody comes to us with a good idea, a totally new approach, not in response to a solicitation, but just a knock on the door saying, I've really got this great thing, I want you to give me a shot at trying it out. Or where we have a problem that needs to be solved and we know that there is this really compelling reason that we don't want to open that up to a competitive solicitation because we have somebody in mind that we know is really uniquely capable of doing that, and we just got to get down to business and do it.
So, David, let's pick this up. What's the relationship between the idea of whether you're operating through a contract or a grant and the idea of a living procurement process that learns as it goes along? Is there a connection between those two? That is, would a living procurement system treat contracts more like they were grants and have fewer terms and treat the terms more as guidelines rather than as formal legal obligations, or is that a completely different set of considerations?
I think that the thought that grants do have more flexibility than contracts, which seems to be part of this discussion, is usually true. But I've also seen very prescriptive grants that are that are overly, sort of overly designed to the solution when in fact you really don't know the solution. I think grants are more frequently used when you want to put seed money into an effort that will deliver something. So my gut feeling is that there should be more flexibility built into grants as long as they don't overly stipulate. Contracts, on the other hand, we want you to do a very specific thing, and then we'll pay you afterwards. So, just in the broadest sense, that's the way I would think of the difference between grants and contracts. I do think that if grants are written well, they do allow people to learn as they go, service providers to learn as they go and to make adjustments and to fine-tune whatever process they're using to get to, a desired result. And as we all know, when we think about inventors, when they go into a laboratory to invent, they have no idea what the outcome is going to be. They have an idea of what they want an outcome to be, but if they're not learning as they go, they're never going to deliver an outcome. They're going to build exactly what they walked into that laboratory thinking they were going to build, and that's not necessarily, the best available solution to the problem. I think we need to consider, whether using grants or contracts, that we are inventors to some degree. When we're looking for solutions to complex problems, we must allow inventive thought that learns as it goes.
Right. Well, I noticed that in your presentation, David, you talked about you might have to accept some contracts for things that were innovative and complex, but you didn't add the word risky. And Renee Sherrill, I think, has been getting nervous about the risk here and how we deal with the risk, because she asked the question, what are a few key controls that are effective for the proposed procurement methodology associated with the conversational approach? So where's the control in a conversational approach? If it's always possible for me as a contractor to say, oh, well, I just learned something new, and so you ought to let me off the hook. How does that work?
That's a good question, Renee, and I think that it's actually in some ways the crux of the problem. It is risk itself that we avoid so carefully in government contracting. I think it's a fundamental difference, really, in government contracting versus the contracting that I believe industry often does, which allows much more flexibility in the route that a solution provider would take to deliver whatever it is that is needed, the good or the service. So I didn't say it, but I think it's good that it comes up in this conversation. We really need to embrace risk, and I think that this is the hardest thing in some ways to talk about, because when spending public money, we want to avoid, we being not only elected but appointed and civil service officials in governments want to avoid risk at all cost, and that it is the most difficult to solve problem that I think that faces us.
You know, it's interesting because I think about the work that we've done in our in the anti-poverty initiative, where new dollars were put on the table that were city tax levy dollars without federal and state regulatory burdens, or city regulatory burdens for that, so completely flexible money, matched by foundation dollars, also completely flexible. We wrote contracts with the vendors who were selected to provide the services. We had a program, 40 different initiatives that we wanted to get off the ground, picked vendors to do that, but because we were in charge of the rules and didn't have to go check through a whole bunch of different, commissioners and state secretaries and federal secretaries, we could be quite active in the course of implementing the contract and changing the rules. And so as we learned and as the providers learned and gave us feedback, sometimes bad results we thought were poor management by the providers and we wouldn't change and we pushed back. Sometimes there were critical learnings about who they were reaching out to and the challenges they were finding that we thought were really critical, and we completely changed the approach. And so I think, it's not, we put the shackles on ourselves, but we're also very burdened by the funding streams that we inherit. And in fact, some of the most interesting stuff happened in the workforce world, where federal WIA standards, Workforce Investment Act standards, really discouraged the more approaching the higher risk populations with the most sort of innovative approaches.
So did you ever have the experience, Linda, of having a contract that went south for what you thought were good reasons, and then you agreed to modify the contract, and then some media or audit oversight agency showed up and said that you gave away the store?
I would say that is a bit of the overlay of the Workforce Investment Act dollars. So, for instance, they basically will incentivize the placements at the lowest cost, but if you want to tackle the challenges of people with histories of incarceration, you have to spend more money. And so the WIA system really discourages that. And and then there's also, the size and the shape of the recipients. And so you try to, sort of figure out how much of your special needs populations can you squeeze in before it's going to pass some kind of a threshold that's going to sound off alarm bells.
Okay. Roy Trefelsky has a very tough question for both of you, it seems to me, and it goes something like this. It says, you guys have both had a pretty good story about being focused on outcomes, but he observes that his organization works on producing outcomes that produce results where the outcomes aren't visible till 5 or 10 years into the future. And I suspect that he thinks he can't quite wait that long to get paid for his outcome. If he managed to produce it. So how do you cope with that situation without giving up the idea that you want to pay for outcomes?
Yeah. Go ahead, David.
Well, I will start only by saying, it really is a tough question, but it's not one that doesn't have a solution. I think this one, when we talk about not thinking in the traditional sense about outcomes, there's the theory that you can invest in solutions, I think. And sadly, I believe in many respects, it's only a theory. It's a structure that exists in business that doesn't seem to exist in government, although I will say in the 2 or 3 years that I've been involved in the discussions we've had in support of this discussion we're having today, that I have seen innovation funds built into governments. One comes to mind in Louisiana. There's certainly one at the federal level. And when the economy is good and when we can develop funds that allow us to take risks and to invest in future outcomes, in other words, seed people to be inventive, then I think we're going to be successful. I don't think that happens oftentimes in a down economy.
I think the issue, though, of inventive and risky is a little bit different than the idea that things take a long time to emerge as results.
Yeah.
So I'm not exactly sure whether we've got a solution to Roy's problem yet. And
Well, I think we got a couple of examples of where we do, and I think this gets to the importance of not just sort of outcome-based contracts, but doing overlays of evaluation that last more than the duration of the contract or the milestones of the contract. So, one thought that comes, and it's complicated. The thing I would add to the problem is the wrong pocket problem. That if I do something to save money, I know it's a good action, and it's going to save money, but it's not going to save me money, it's going to save somebody else money. So if I do a community-based prevention program, it's going to reduce incarceration, but that saves money in the jail, and it costs me money. So you both have to deal with the delays associated with getting the benefits, as well as finding a way of putting all the parties together in a common interest and dealing with shifting the dollars around so that you can take some of those high-end costs of institutions and move them over to other agencies where you can do the prevention. And so I think that the thing that I've been focused on myself is really trying to take the research and evaluation, feed it into a net present value analysis, and use that as the evidence to secure funding for strategies that will produce the good outcomes you're going for. And we have, I think the cleanest example of that is the Nurse-Family Partnership Program, where you have, 15 to 20 years of good research and longitudinal analysis to show not just how it reduces the child abuse when the kid in the program is young, but how it reduces their juvenile delinquency and increases maternal employment. And so you can really add up these social benefits over time, but you needed the investment in the evaluation of the intervention from the get-go.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time for one more, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions and ask you if people on the line were motivated to try to move in your direction on procurement reform, A, how long do you think they should expect it to take, and B, what portion of it would involve a significant change in the orientation and competence and culture of the procurement officers?
Well, I think it's long term, and I think we have to go in looking at it as long term for a couple of reasons. A lot of sort of stars have to align, I think, carry this off even in one place, such as Washington, D.C. or New York City. Number one, courageous leadership at the chief executive level, and courageous leadership in the other elected officials. When you have that, you have a built-in impetus, I think, to move forward. But in the question, I think you bring up the long-term component of it when you talk about actually changing the way procurement professionals, who have been taught forever to exercise control and to stay within a very narrow path. I think that's the longer-term solution. So even in a place like Washington, D.C., where I believe we have a courageous mayor and an innovative council, all of whom are in support of procurement reform, I think we have the challenge I see on a daily basis in my office is exactly the one related to how do you modify the workforce. When are we going to start hiring, instead of control freaks, when are we going to start hiring innovators, inventors? When are we going to start hiring solutions providers? And I think there's a whole number of issues that are related to that. From the beginning, rewriting position descriptions as to what we're looking for.
Linda?
I concur.
Okay.
Yes.
I think we've come to the end of our scheduled time, and Linda and David, if you could stay on the phone for a little bit longer, I think we could now end the webinar.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I just want to remind you that we have 2 more webinars in the series. I'm going to pull them up right now as everyone's departing so you can see when they are. Thank you very much to Deputy Mayor Gibbs, to Professor Moore, and also to David Gragan for joining us today, and for the audience for the great questions and joining us as well.